What is up, everybody? It's me, Josh, and I'm bringing you guys yet another Yu-Gi-Oh video. Today we're taking a look at Handtraps and board breakers in the current format. Should you be playing Handtraps? Should you be playing board breakers? And if so, which ones are you using? We're doing it in the form of a tier list. Let me know if you think this is the best way to do it. And as always, if you enjoy this type of content, make sure to leave a like or a comment on the video and subscribe to the channel for more content like that. Without further ado, I hope this video helps you preparing for your next event. Let's get started. Right before we start though, I want to say I left the categories a little more vague on purpose this time. What I usually do is like, oh, good in the main deck, good in the side deck, or only okay in the main. It's very hard to do this with non-engine cards because like obviously certain cards are better in the main than they are in the side, but like I still find it weird to call a card that's really good in a side deck staple only like okay in the main or whatever. It's hard for me to say basically. So instead of doing that, we're just gonna rate the cards based on their playability between main and side deck, right? And whether you want to main or side deck those cards is just something we're gonna talk about while we discuss the cards. And so that's just going to be something that you're going to have to listen to if you're watching this live or on YouTube and make your own decision. Let me actually bring up the spreadsheet just so we have some context on what the current format even is. Preparing for YCS Bologna, this is the kind of format you expect to face. The most played deck was Tenpai, but then shortly after there was Pure Snake Eye and Snake Eye Fire King, which are rather similar. And if you combine those two, then they would make up the most popular deck of the format. I think it's a fair thing to say that the most popular deck is Snake Eye variants, then Tenpai, then you've got Belle chilling next to Centurion, and I think everything else is considered rogue at this point. There's a decent amount of rogue decks that are playable, but the ones that are mainly here to focus on, I think, is Tenpai, Snake Eye versions, Belle, Centurion. I think spell trap removal overall is rather mediocre. If you're playing Tenpai, I think playing Duster and Lightning Storm in your main deck or side deck is okay, especially post side. They can help with some floodgates that people can use against Tenpai, like there can be only one, or deck lockdown is in some of the Centurion decks. Of course, if they make Auxilla, then the Lightning Storm and Duster also don't work there. Lightning Storm and Feather Duster float around the A and B tier in Tenpai, but in other decks I would not really recommend these cards. I think there's better cards for going second than back row removal, and there's not really a deck in the format that really suffers from it. However, I think Cosmic Cyclone is a whole different beast. I think Cosmic Cyclone is an S tier card right now. It's being played a lot already, so I have a hard time calling it underrated. It does so many things if you look at this current format. Against Fire King, the card is good going first and second because you can hit Fire King Island with it to out their entire board. You can also hit Fire King Island when they're trying to make their board. It's very good against Centurion going first and second because you can stop them from synchro summoning on your turn by hitting either the field spell or the Centurions in their spell and trap zone. It's also good at stopping Centurion when you go first. Whether you side deck it against Tenpai depends on your deck and what other cards you have, but it can be very good against Tenpai because you can hit the field spell and then you can interact with all their board. It's good against Belle if you go first. I wouldn't side it going second against Belle. Cosmic Cyclone is just super versatile and has very high value targets in every matchup, and that makes it an S tier card overall. But I want to preface that by saying I think it's still a side deck card only. I simply think in too many matchups it is not good enough going second. Keep this also in mind when you're watching this. Your deck choice in a way also should depend on what kind of non-engine people play at the moment, and I think Cosmic Cyclone is very popular, so like playing a deck that sucks into Cosmic Cyclone is very risky right now. If you're thinking like, oh, should I play a runic combo deck right now? My answer, probably not, because a lot of the non-engine that people play at the moment are very good against it. Retaliating C is a card that I think has seen a decent amount of popularity in recent weeks, and I do like the card. I think it is powerful. The thing that you have to realize is that it only works against some of the decks. It's rather niche, so right off the get-go, I think it's only a side deck card. My issue with it, yes, it's good against Snake Eye and Fire King, but it only works if your opponent decides to go for the Azamina portion. For example, if you're playing against Pure Snake Eye and they start with the Belle Star and you let it go through, your opponent after side decking could very easily make the decision to just go directly for original instead of going for Azamina cards. At that point, it will become a little bit awkward. Like, yeah, you can still retaliating on OSS, but then they can just summon Ash, search Poplar, summon Poplar, make SP to banish your Retaliating C, and then maybe keep playing. It's not as good on on OSS than it is on Deception, I think. I'm gonna rate it A or B. That is up to you, right? Do you want to play a card that's only good in basically one matchup? Because out of these other matchups, I don't think there is many popular decks that this card hits. I just have a database, basically a folder where all of these images are, and I just keep adding them back. Chalice seems too low impact to me right now. I'm not sure if there is a deck where I would play Chalice. I can't think of one, so I'm just gonna throw it in D for now. Droll and Lockbird is a card that I'm gonna throw in A tier. I think Droll and Lockbird is solid. I like it, specifically against Fire King, and I do also like it against Azamina. The problem with Droll and Lockbird is that it doesn't stop your opponent from really getting anything, if that makes sense. Let's say you imperm your opponent or you ash your opponent, they will also lose a card in the process, or like they will miss out on a search or something. With Droll and Lockbird, it is possible for them to hold their resources for the next turn because they don't stop playing entirely, right? It depends on their hand, but they might still set up some board and then might have some non-engine. And then if your deck can't punish that really hard, then drolling is not as impactful. It is also in some decks an option to stop your opponent's Fuwalos or Purilia. I think that is rather niche and usually not a winning play because you will usually have to give your opponent a couple cards and then also lose a Droll and Lockbird. Sometimes it can be worth it. The reason why I'm still putting it in A is because I think it's main deckable, right? And that's important, right? A lot of these cards so far were only good in the side deck. Droll is actually a card that you can main deck, and I think it's solid for that. Called by the Grave is also an A tier card right now. I like it. The only reason I'm not throwing it in S is because in some matchups, if you go second, it's not good enough. My suggestion is in every single deck that loses to Shifter, you should at least side decking Called by the Grave, which is a lot of decks in the format. In some decks, you can even main deck it because it can also be good going second into like the fire decks. I think Called by the Grave is very versatile right now. It has a lot of high value targets in the format, so I think it's a very, very powerful card. Crossout Designator is probably also an A tier card. This card I would not main deck right now. I think if you main deck Crossout in any deck, you make it way too centered around winning the dice roll because Crossout going second, quite frankly, is terrible into any of the meta decks. If you start with it, going second, it'll basically be a blank. If your opponent combos, you are not beating it. The reason why I don't think it's S tier is because in the decks that are afraid of Fuwalos or Purilia, you have to do some very awkward deck building when you're going first. You would have to have a Fuwalos in your deck, or you would have to have a Purilia in your deck to be able to cross them out, and you don't have to draw them. Honestly, there's other solutions that people are doing to beat Fuwalos that I think might be better than Crossout, and that's why it's not S tier. The alternative is Thrust. Thrust is something that people use in a lot of decks right now. It's exclusively a side deck card from what I'm seeing in most decks, but it is a very effective one because what people do is they just start their turn, they see if they get Fuwalos or Purilia. Instead of negating it with a Crossout, which requires you to play a brick, they just play Thrust with D-Barrier or Different Dimension Ground, so that if you get your turn skipped by one of the Fuwaloses or Dimension Shifter, you can just turn skip them back. As cringe of a concept as turn skipping is, I think it's very effective. I think it's more effective than Crossout at beating the Molch Armies and Shifter because you don't have to play the bricks for it in the main deck. Because if you go first and you draw a D-Barrier against Tenpai, that is much better than drawing a Fuwalos that you kept in your deck because of Crossout. I think Thrust is a very good side deck card, and it's very funny because normally Thrust is like something that people use for going second. In this format, I don't even know if these decks really side deck this card going second, maybe in some matchups, but for the most part, this is just for going first. I mean, look, I think Fuwalos and Purilia, you don't have to have an out for those. Like, you can play a deck that has solid lines under it. Shifter is just very, very hard to outplay, right? So being able to set barrier with Thrust is very powerful. And I think that is more reliable than Crossout. And also, I didn't include cards like D-Barrier and Different Dimension Ground in the list because I just wanted to mention them alongside Thrust. Those cards, obviously, for going first, they are good. We don't have to talk about it. If you want to play cards for going first in your side deck, cards like Thrust, D-Barrier, Different Dimension Grounds, those are like go-to good options. Dark Ruler No More, I think, is not very good right now. I don't see a great use case for it. I think board breakers, low-key, are a little bit better than people give it credit for. Theoretically, against like Fire King or Snake Eye versions, you could break their boards with the right breakers. I think Dark Ruler No More just is not the one for that because so much interaction happens from the graveyard or from the spell trap zone or even from the hand. You add to that Dark Ruler No More is basically not main deckable, because that is the thing with board breakers right now. I think board breakers are genuinely okay into the fire decks, and they are also okay into Belle, depending on what kind of board breakers you can play. But because Tenpai takes up such a huge portion of the format and that forces you to go first, you can't really main deck board breakers because they all suck going first against Tenpai. Like, even the ones that theoretically have a use case, like a Droplet, is not great against Tenpai, because if they make you start, you never know if they play Lightning Storm or Duster or whatever, and then even then, Droplet is very inefficient. We'll rate some board breakers higher than this. I think some of them are genuinely playable right now, but Dark Ruler is just not it. Ash Blossom, Omega S tier right now. I don't think we have to talk about it. This is one of those formats where Ash has super valuable targets against all of the decks. It even helps you stop the Mulcharmies if your deck really cares about them. All right, let's talk about the Dominus cards before I forget, because I unfortunately forgot to put them in. Dominus Impulse, right next to Ash Blossom, Omega S tier. If your deck can play it, period. Dominus Purge is underrated because there's not many decks that can play it. I mean, I don't know, Voiceless Voice, I guess, or something. I would put it into like low A tier. Impulse is S because there's very strong meta decks that can just play Impulse. Dominus Purge is still good. There's not many decks that can use it, but in those decks, it's still good. Belle is like a B tier hand trap right now. My issue with Belle, basically, if you look at the format right now, you also have to look at how many hand traps can people play. I'm actually happy to report that I feel like the average number of hand traps, while it's still up there, it's gone down slightly from past formats. The Snake Eye decks, especially the Fire King versions, they're like down to like 12 to 15. Ash Blossom is set in stone. Impulse is set in stone. We're going to talk about Imperm, but Imperm is phenomenal. Then a lot of decks are also main decking Fuwalos right now, which is also fair enough. We'll talk about that later. And so while I don't think Belle is a bad card, with the amount of slots that people have available, I just don't think Belle makes the cut. I'm not going to put it in C or D because I think Belle has use cases, right? Like, you can stop Wanted with it. You can sometimes maybe catch someone off guard and stop the Flamberge revive if they don't chain block properly. You can negate Cult by the Grave. That's one of the few cards that can do that. I would only play the card if you have a lot of room for hand traps, basically. Most decks right now don't have that. The only decks that can maybe take a look at Belle are decks like Centurion, but I don't think Belle is part of the best 15 or 18 hand traps. I think books are quite bad. In Ritual Beast, Book of Eclipse is probably like a B tier card. You can use it to dodge like Veiler, Imperm, Nibiru, and then you can still contact Fuse, but that's a very niche use case, I feel like. I'll put Eclipse in high C because there is use cases for it. Overall, I wouldn't recommend Book of Eclipse though. Effect Negation hand traps. Veiler, Imperm, Mourner. I think Imperm is S tier because it doesn't trigger Thrust, especially post side. It also has great synergies with Dominus Impulse. If you Imperm first, then your Impulse could destroy a card that it would otherwise not destroy. That's really cool. I'm putting Veiler and Mourner into A tier, and this is simply because of what I said earlier for Belle. Both of these cards are good. The problem is they might not make the cut, right? You also have to decide between, do I want more effect negation or do I just want to Droll? I think it's like kind of in between here. But the thing is, like, if you make your non-engine for these meta decks right now, there's very little wiggle room, right? You're going to play Ash, you're going to play Imperm, you're going to play Impulse, you're probably going to play Fuwalos, and then you're already at 12. You don't have that many choices left to make, right? You can't play Veiler and Mourner and Droll. That's why these cards lose some value, because they just have strong competition, but I still want to put them up here because if you do play a deck that plays a lot of hand traps, like for example, the Centurion deck I played at regionals, I played both Veiler and Mourner and I really liked them, but I wouldn't do that in Fire King, for example, because I don't have the room for it. The reason why I think Mourner is still good, even though it is worse than Veiler and Imperm, I think negating Bellstar, it's such an important piece of the combo, right? Being able to just negate Bellstar is really, really nice. Both conflict with Impulse, that is also true. If you're playing an Impulse deck, you're much better off just not playing those. Bystials, I am unfortunately putting into the B tier. As non-engine, Bystials are not great at the moment. They simply don't do enough to the Snake Eye and Fire King decks. They don't do anything against Tenpai. Literally, the only reason to play Bystials right now, in my opinion, is because you want them as an engine. For example, you're playing Centurion and you want the grind game from Regained and you want the quick synchro into Chaos Angel, those kind of things, fine. But if you're just playing them for non-engine, they're not great. Then we have Change of Heart, Mind Control type of cards that you just take your opponent's board with with. I don't think these are great right now. I mean, I don't have to tell you, but that is only side deck, never main deck. If you play against Fire King, they will probably just gear in whatever you try to take. Against pure Snake Eye, it also won't do much. I think they're better than Dark Ruler in some matchups, but like they're just not enough. Ghost Reaper and Winter Cherries. This thing is always here, and every time we do this, I have to think about like, is there an actual good application for this at the moment? If there was an experimental category, I would put this card in that one right now, because I feel like there are some valuable targets, but I don't know if there are enough valuable targets. I'm not convinced that this does enough unless you pair it with a bunch of other hand traps. But at that point, if you're playing a lot of hand traps, then why don't you just prevent your opponent from doing stuff instead of taking away one extra deck option? DD Crow is not bad, but I think it suffers a similar problem than Belle. It simply does not make the cut, which does not mean it's terrible. And if you do play a deck with a lot of non-engine spaces, you can consider it. Super Poly. Look, I think playing board breakers right now is definitely not the norm. People are playing hand traps, and I think that's for good reason. But I think if you were to try a board breaker approach, I think Super Poly is one of the better ones. If you go first against Tenpai, for example, and you get shifted, it's a decent interruption against Tenpai if they don't hard open the field spell. In theory, if your deck has extra deck space, I think the Super Polys are fine in a board breaker approach, so I could see it. Darkhole Raigeki. The thing about these cards, I'm looking at them and I'm like, if I have one of those cards against Fire King, they have more monsters on their field than before you Raigeki. You need multiples, and then they actually start hurting the deck, right? Because like the first time around, everything floats. The second time around, maybe just the Arvata floats or something like that, or just the Kirin, but then they're done, right? But honestly, I still don't see any deck playing that kind of approach other than Tenpai. If you're playing Tenpai, you could try and compare the hand trap approach to the board wipe approach, and maybe you will end up liking the board wipes better against the fire matchups. Possible. But I think in other decks, I don't see myself going that route, because the general problem about Snake Eye, the same as always, is like if you let them play, they will always have a lot of guaranteed follow-up, especially Fire King Snake Eye. Like if you don't kill that deck, they will kill you most of the time unless you are able to stop them from getting into their engine with hand traps. So like you can Darkhole Raigeki Snake Eye, but if you don't kill them, they probably still win, and that's difficult. Droplet is another one of those, if you were playing a board breaker deck, then this card is a solid option, because you can use it going first, you can use it going second, and it will interact with a decent portion of the Snake Eye board. Not everything though. Still Promethean in the graveyard, potentially Kirin and Garunix in hand. The popularity of the Fire King as Amina cards right now, they make board breakers so much harder to play. The Fire King deck just has crazy layered interruption. It's very hard to negate something and then cook, right? I would probably prefer Econ over Change of Heart and Mind Control, because there's a small chance you could main deck it, and it lets you dodge effect negation, which is very common right now. You can like take away their fire monsters, so they might not have something to destroy with Promethean or something like that. It's okay. To be fair, I think Book of Eclipse goes here though. Evenly Matched sucks against Tenpai, obviously. It kind of sucks against Centurion, because you have to waste your battle phase just to get Omni negated on it. The problem with Evenly is you do need to pair Evenly with another non-engine. If you don't pair evenly, it will just get negated by every single deck, right? If they're playing the Fiendsmith cards in their Snake Eye deck or Yubel deck, they will have Desiree to negate it. If they're just playing Azamina cards, they will have the Azamina Omni negate. Even if evenly resolves against Fire King, they might still have a lot of interruptions, because like Kirin in hand, Garunix in graveyard, Promethean in graveyard, there's no guarantee you win even after resolving evenly. However, I will say there is the same problem with some hand traps, right? Certain hand traps also will not be enough alone, so you need to pair those non-engines as well. I think evenly is not terrible, but it also isn't great, so I'm gonna put it at the top of C. Fenrir, or Cash Tira cards in general. The thing is, I've seen some people play these in like, what, Centurion, that has more room for non-engine, because I think it is pretty similar to cards like Belle, Crow, and Bystials. This will never be your first choice of non-engine, right? This could be your non-engine choice if you have infinite space for non-engine, like 20 or something, and you don't want to play all hand traps. Fenrir is okay, right? So I think it just goes into the B tier. It can carry some games, but you will not prioritize prioritize it over other non-engine. Psyframes, and this is not just Gamma. If you watched my Centurion deck profile from regionals, I played Delta as well. I tried them. I liked them. Every time I drew Delta, it was actually quite impactful against the Snake Eye deck. I'm gonna put it into B tier because it's only side deck, never main deck, and you have to play a driver for it. It is worth pointing out that it's a little dangerous because people play Thrust, but the payoff is potentially really strong, right? Like stopping, deception, and all that kind of stuff is pretty nice. Tributing your opponent's shit is the next category. Kaijus, too low impact. No shot, one kaiju is good enough. Same with Santa Claus. The only exception, Tenpai, I have seen play these cards to out the Fucho, the little rank 1 that the fire decks can make on their shifter or just in general when they know it's Tenpai. For that one specific use case, then those cards are good. In that case, they would be like a B tier option, but in general, I wouldn't recommend playing them. If I sphere mode my opponent against you, Belle or Snake Eye, that is pretty impactful. Lava Golem is kind of iffy because that gives them a fire monster for Promethean and Garunix. It's actually kind of randomly annoying. That's why I think Lava Golem is kind of ass. So I think sphere mode is the better one, and it is very niche because not many decks can use it, but if your deck can, it's fine. The wonderful thing about Kurikara is that now that we're doing a non-engine tier list and not a hand trap and board breaker separate version, people can stop asking where Kurikara is, because whenever I make a hand trap discussion, people are like, where's Kurikara? Anyways, Kurikara sucks. It's in D tier, in case you're wondering. Lancea, can't think of a use case right now that is realistic, so I'm putting it down to D tier. Metaltronus, I think, had a great time in the last format when every deck was playing Fiendsmith. It had some very niche applications. I think right now, a little iffy. It's like a B tier card, low B tier. It's just like you need a very specific reason to play it. In most decks, you're just going to play these cards up here instead, and that's probably better. Yeah, it's difficult to play that card right now. Here's the thing with Nibiru. Nibiru alone does not work against any of the decks in the format. But if you pair Nibiru, it becomes stronger in some of those matchups. And it also is one of those cards that in theory, it shouldn't work against those decks. In practice, when you play a tournament, there are a decent amount of people that will not know the perfect lines to play around Nibiru, and they will go for suboptimal plays into it, and then you can punish them. It's like one of those moments where if you play Nibiru, you're gonna have it in your hand a decent amount of the time, and your opponent is gonna respect it, and it's not gonna be great. But then when you cut Nibiru, you're gonna definitely have games where your opponent just ints into it 100%, and you are like, oh man, if I had Nibiru here, you'd be cooked, right? So I think it's subjective whether you want to play it. In theory, it's only, I think, in B tier right now, but obviously it gets better the more people disrespect it and the more people like make suboptimal combos. Ghost Ogre and Snow Rabbit goes around here. I kind of like it right now. I actually think it's a solid card. It has applications against all of the meta decks, right? It's good against Centurion. It's good against Azamina cards. It's good against IP Masquerena. It's good against the Belle continuous spell, Nightmare Pain. Even against Tenpai. If they have the field spell and they use it to search, you can Ghost Ogre it. So I think Ghost Ogre is quite flexible right now. In Centurion, I liked it because that deck didn't play Impulse anyways, but I don't think it makes the cut in some of the fire decks because they prioritize Impulse over it, but it still is a good card. Pankratops, rather low impact right now, would not recommend. C tier. Molcharmies, to everyone's surprise, both of these cards are S tier. I will say, despite Molcharmy Fuwalos being a very popular card right now, I think people are overplaying it a little bit. It is S tier, but I unironically think there are some decks out there that shouldn't play it and they are still playing it. For example, I did not play this card in my Centurion deck because my Centurion deck was trying to stop my opponent from cooking, and Fuwalos is the kind of card that wants your opponent to cook. You should only play Fuwalos in decks that has very strong engine that can beat over your opponent's boards. That includes Fire King Snake Eye, maybe Belle, and Tenpai. Those kind of decks are perfect to play with Fuwalos because if your opponent makes a weaker board and gives you 2 or 3 cards, you can definitely punish that. In like Centurion, I didn't feel like playing it because I don't want my opponent to even make a half board because Centurion is not very good at breaking that. In those kind of decks, I think Purilia is really, really good. And I'm gonna be honest with you, even though Fuwalos comes out and kind of like overshadows it, I think Purilia lost nothing in its quality. I think Purilia is still a crazy good card. Both of these cards are format defining and S tier for sure. Dimension Shifter goes into the S tier right away. That card's insane. If your deck can play Shifter, it should play Shifter. Simple as that. Skullmeister, probably after Bystials or after DD Crow. In a hypothetical world, Skullmeister is a fine card, but it would be your hand trap number 24 or something, which means that most decks are simply not going to play it. Is Dogwood missing? I mean, Dogwood is not a hand trap, guys. What do you want me to say about Dogwood? Yes, if you're close to time, Dogwood is crazy. If you're not close to time, Dogwood is shit. Ultimate Slayer goes right into the batch of board breakers that if you were to play board breakers, it is good. The bigger question is, do you even want to play board breakers to begin with? But if you do, I think Slayer is fine. If you have the extra deck space, it's very similar to Super Poly, with the downside that Super Poly is better in the main because it's better going first. Talents, it's not amazing, but it has solid applications going first and second. The main reason why Talents is in the A tier right now is because most people will want to play a one-of copy of Talents because most people will play Thrust. I don't think Talents is S tier because as a standalone non-engine, it's not as good. Purilia and sometimes Fuwalos can happen in the draw phase. Going second, I think I would rather draw a hand trap than Talents because most boards are not broken by a single Talents. I think Talents is good as a 1 or 2 of, but I wouldn't recommend playing 3 copies of Talents in most decks. And then we have Phantazmay. I hate to say it, but I don't think it's that great right now. Problem with Phantazmay is the following things. Number 1, sucks against Tenpai. Number 2, Phantazmay happens against the fire decks at a point where you already wanted to stop them. What are you going to draw with Phantazmay right now? You cannot draw Imperm, you cannot draw Fuwalos, you cannot draw Purilia because you have monsters on the board. You can draw into like Veiler, Ash. If you draw into Ogre, it won't do anything because they usually start with the Azamina stuff, right? And the Azamina stuff doesn't trigger the Phantazmay. So I think Phantazmay is mid. It kind of works with board breakers if you want to, that'd be fine. But like most of these hand traps are best if you use them early, and so Phantazmay draws them usually too late, so I don't love it. What about the Solemns? I think Solemns are fine right now. Citing them for going first is okay. I don't think they're better than the Thrust package though. And I don't know if you play both. I quite like the approach of I'm gonna play a Thrust package, so I go first and I try to combo, and if they stop me or Fuwalos or Shifter or anything, I just Thrust to set D barrier. That feels better to me than just setting 1 Judgment or 1 Strike. Magical Spring? I mean, the problem is I think it's good against Centurion, but good against Centurion only. I don't think that's worth it, to be honest with you. Like, I think at that point, just play Cosmic and Ghost Ogre, and you're gonna have better coverage while still being good against Centurion. If you are watching this on YouTube, I hope this helps you decide what kind of deck to play and what kind of non-engine to play in it. If there's any other cards that you would like my opinion on, then feel free to drop a comment down below. I'll try to answer them. Thank you for watching the video, and make sure to subscribe to the channel if you like that kind of content, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye bye. Say goodbye to YouTube chat.